Greetings to one and all here. I, Satya Pulkuri, the Associate Editor of the forum. I welcome you all to the keynote session on how to fight and lose a space war, featuring our speaker, Mr. Paul Szymanski, organized by Indic Researchers Forum. Indic Researchers Forum is a think tank that aims at bringing out quality research on geopolitics, national security, international relations through a civilizational perspective. Without any further ado, allow me to invite our keynote speaker, Mr. Paul Szymanski. Mr. Szymanski has 48 years of experience in all fields related to space control, policy, strategy, simulations, surveillance, survivability, threat assessment, long-range strategic planning, and command and control. In addition, he has a comprehensive experience base, having worked directly with multiple services, including Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines, civil agencies, including NASA, DARPA, FEMA, and from the Pentagon to systems development, technology development to operational field test. This gives a unique perspective in understanding the divergent issues associated with each step of the DoD procurement process. He developed a private discussion group consisting of 20,026 hand-picked members interested in the outer space warfare, whose member consists of 1,961 general officers and admirals, 58 current and former undersecretaries of defense, including one former secretary of defense, 284 joint chief of staff, including 3 former chairmen and the joint chiefs of staff, past and current commanders of the 3rd, 4th, 5th Pacific and Korean naval fleets, 628 congressional House and Senate staffers, 180 diplomats, 306 from the White House and National Security Council staff, and 58 astronauts, among others. Now, I hand over the floor to Mr. Szymanski. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Let me see if I can switch over to my presentation. Not used to this system. Okay, I want to establish, can everyone see my PowerPoint slide, first slide?
Yes, sir, we can see your slide.
Okay, great. Again, I'm Paul Szymanski, and I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, United States. It's the land of Breaking Bad and Billy the Kid, if you're familiar with those things. And I just want to give you a general introduction to outer space warfare and illustrate some space incidents, wars, whatever you want to call them, that have happened in the past, particularly for the Ukrainian conflict. So I guess I've got a pretty good introduction already, but I'm going to look at past history, basic principles of fighting space wars, looking what happened in 2014 in particular over the Ukrainian conflict back then, what lessons were learned in terms of what are applicable to space war, and then a few words on what's happening this year in space over Ukraine. And then I'll leave the floor open to questions to anyone who want something more specific. So I guess I've already been described, but I've been around the block. I've done this for 48 years. I have close to 100 different publications and so forth, literally around the world. Have worked with a lot of different sources, a lot of different people. And I want to mention this is an unclassed briefing. It's all based on open source material. And just a more complete list, I guess, of all the organizations I supported over those last 48 years. And you're welcome to a copy of this briefing if you wish. And then, you know, I'm noted for a lot of my work, what I have done in the past, what I'm doing now, and hopefully what I will be doing in the future. So, as a general introduction to outer space warfare, I like this quote from Winston Churchill. And he says, you may take the most gallant sailor, the most intrepid airman, or the most audacious soldier, and you put them together in a room, and what do you get? The sum of their fears. And what I want to emphasize is you might really think, oh, space war, it's high tech, this and that. but it's still controlled by primitive human minds and human emotions. And that's important to understand the basics of space strategy and doctrine and so forth. So just mention it, all warfare is between human minds. And also space, it's mostly generating information for use on the terrestrial battlefield. It's generating imagery information, signals intelligence, weather information, navigational information, and transmitting that information. So in some sense, a space war is a information warfare. And you've got to understand that you're not necessarily attacking a satellite or a space system, you're attacking the information that it's generating. And you have to understand how does that flow on the battlefield, its importance, the multiple paths it goes over, what are the time delays and so forth. Because you might want to not necessarily just take out a satellite, you might want to just delay the information. And space is more than just satellites. I mean, if you cut off all satellites from communication to a particular adversary on the ground, those space systems are worthless. You know, ultimately it has to come to the ground and do something on the ground. So the other thing I want to emphasize is whether you're talking about ancient Greek warfare, Middle Ages kinds of warfare, modern warfare, it's still a contest between adversary commanders' minds based on either, you know, the doctrine, the culture, their education, their experience, their fears, and everything. And essentially, these commanders employ military equipment and soldiers and sailors and guardians and so forth to transmit their will and resolve on each other. And it's really about not eliminating the whole population. It's about realigning the geopolitical landscape, ultimately. And when you really think about it, there's three phases, so to speak, to war. There's a peacetime where you are planning for war and you're, you know, recruiting soldiers and you're training them and you're developing doctrine and you're spending money on equipment and you're training and you're trying to figure where to put that equipment around the world and who the potential adversaries might be. And so if you get that wrong, you might lose the war. And then you have the war, the classic war, where things are blowing up and you know, equipment is being destroyed. But what you're really fighting is the peace. You're fighting some sort of objective that you want to reshape the landscape peacetime. So really, you're not just like fighting the war, you're fighting the peace. And this is important for space too. I mean, you could sit there and say, well, I won that space war. Oh, geez, sorry, we made all this space junk. And so, in some sense, you lost the peace, and maybe you lost some allies and things like that. So you can't just sit there and say, look at these cool space weapons I have. You have to understand, you know, the political, diplomatic consequences, economic consequences of using those, using them at certain phases of a conflict. A lot of potential space capabilities, especially in the cyber world, are they expire, so to speak. You use them once and then the adversary knows your capabilities. So you don't want to use everything you've got for a minor conflict or just to show resolve and so forth. You've got to have a certain degree of surprise that you hold back. So, you know, I want to emphasize again, is this ancient Greek historian more than 2,000 years ago, he said it's not the objective of war to annihilate those who would give a provocation for it, but to cause them to mend their ways. In other words, change their behavior in the peacetime. And then the other thing I want to emphasize too is there's a lot of people who say, oh, we shouldn't have war in space and this is terrible and all that. Well, it has happened, it is happening, it will happen, and you can't be like an ostrich hiding your head in the sand. Whether you like it or not, it's going to bite you one way or the other. And the space has become way too important to the United States and actually other adversaries now. So you can't really ignore what might be happening in the near future. So And there's a lot of potential threats, and I don't intend to go through all of this. But if you have, let's say, a satellite, these are fake names. I have a software I developed that automatically generates for military exercises fake names of systems to keep them unclassified. So let's say we have this satellite. It happens to be a signals intelligence satellite. And there's various ways to get to it. And by get to it, I really mean deny its capability. That's what you're really doing. If you've got some secret way to turn it off and make it start spinning or whatever, you don't have to blow it up. Its mission is no longer capable. And so you've kind of done your job. So the latest in thing, in everyone around the block in the geopolitical sphere has to have these inspector satellites, maintenance satellites, like illustrated here, or just something I drew myself. It's called rendezvous and proximity operations. And, even NASA has had some of these and is developing more. There's commercial companies that are going up to refuel, repair satellites. And to my mind, in some sense, it's a perfect space weapon system. It's the equivalent of taking a satellite, put it in a wheelbarrow, wheeling it into your garage, and then going at it. Let's drill a hole here. Let's cut this wire. Let's bend this. Let's pull it out of orbit. Let's saw this. And, you can do anything you want if you got these manipulator arms to mess with another satellite system. And the U.S. will probably talk about the 6 inspector satellites. I don't know if they have a manipulator arms or anything that they have up. There's a lot of talk about Russian inspector satellites coming close to other satellites. China has been messing with that too. So, everyone again has to have it because the other guy has it. And a lot of people think that's a perfect kind of attack system. If you're in low Earth orbit, though, it just seems to me you have a orbital pass that will only be 5 to 7 minutes long before the satellite becomes out of view. And artificial intelligence isn't good enough for these manipulator attack satellites to do the job on their own. They have to have teleoperation from the ground. And I've been part of systems to develop the ground system where you have 2 joysticks and 6 degrees of freedom, and you fly these things around. Now, there's issues in that if you've got a geosynchronous satellite, it has multi-kilowatt antennas, communication antennas. You don't want to go in front of those and get fried. You don't want to pass, let's say, it's star sensors, because there'd be a blip, so to speak, and they know you're there. You want to avoid reaction control systems that might contaminate your satellite. So there's a lot of issues, and there's even a thought I had that if you simulated different attack structures, you would see that, well, if someone wants to go against my antenna or my solar panels or this or that, they will approach different ways so that you could actually detect their intent, maybe, according to how they are approaching. But getting back to it, if somebody has to be on the ground operating this manipulator satellite, you don't have much time if it's low Earth orbit coming over. Geosynchronous maybe. So you really need a relay satellite to bounce that signal back to you. And that makes the relay satellites single points of failures or choke points or whatever you want to call it. And then there's a lot of classical, laser anti-satellites. I don't know of any, but they've been talking about that for decades. There's the even more classical space mines, which might be just you hit it and blow it up and it's in pieces, or maybe it's something that flies by that's just inserts a cyber code into it. And the military likes to think of, well, you're taking out a mission, a capability, and there's at least 3 ways to do that. I mean, you can mess with the satellite, and there's a lot of ways to mess with it without creating space debris. I have a briefing on 94 ways to do that. You could take out the ground centers, either cyber attacks, take out their power supply, special forces coming in, or you could take out the link between the satellite and the ground center. So at least you got those 3 things. And then there's been some thought given to, well, if you're way back at the factory and you're building this satellite, what parts are you using? Are there Trojan horse cyber code in there that 10 years later will be initiated and then you lose your satellite? So that, there's a lot of things like that. You can go against a user's launch capability before they even launch the satellite. I mean, you'd probably have to be at war. You have to be very careful with that, though, because there's all these highly volatile chemicals at launch sites, and you could create a poisonous cloud that goes over a nearby city or something like that. So there's just a lot of issues to think about. Now, a little bit of history of space war. Well, my gosh, it goes all the way back to Roman times. Lucian's True History wrote about Roman legions attacking the moon, science fiction. I guess they had giant spiders they had to deal with and so forth. And then there was a famous space artist in the 1950s, just after Sputnik and the first launches into space. And he has this space fighter attacking a satellite. There was various United States, mostly nuclear systems. I myself worked on the F-15 ASAT program down here at the Pentagon, but this was an even earlier one, Bold Orion. You can look up on the internet, and if you got this briefing, you can click on these links. There was a anti-aircraft cannon put on the Almaz, Russian space station, and I think they tested it a bit. And I'm not exactly sure how that works. If you've got some weapon or some satellite coming close and you shoot it, well, all the debris doesn't fall down to the ground. It keeps coming at you, like a shotgun blast. So I'm not sure what you did. But at any rate, there was the F-15 anti-satellite, launched from an aircraft, which gives a certain degree of flexibility of inclination and so forth, or you could send it to different parts of the world, though it's kinetic kill. And I think a lot of people say that, that's kind of not the way to go. But who knows if you're desperate if you were doing that. And the U.S. has declared a moratorium on testing such things, and so I don't know if anyone else will follow. During the 1980s, the Russians had their own kinetic anti-satellite, ASAT, was more like a shotgun pellets. And there's been various Russian anti-satellite concepts, ground-based lasers, sort of the Frank Tinsley kind of concept of a space plane. I mean, some have talked about the mini space plane that's been up there for a few years that the U.S. has, what exactly it's doing, X-37B, I forget, program. And then to emphasize that there's all kinds of methods to deny space capabilities to an adversary. And one is to take out the ground terminals. And this is what happened in Desert Storm. The U.S. attacked various Iraqi heavy earth terminals to deny their capability. I used to know the Navy captain who was in charge of Schwarzkopf's staff during Desert Storm. And he told me that Schwarzkopf put the French forces on the leftmost of the left hook to make them the most vulnerable so that they would turn off their spot imagery satellite systems, which was commercial, that the Iraqis could use, and so that was another form of attack, diplomatic attack or something that you could call it, to force an adversary to do something. Now, one could, let's say, take out the terminals in Iraq, and this is the old days. Nowadays, you don't need heavy earth terminals like this, 100 feet wide. You have almost suitcase size kinds of things. And especially for commercial space systems, there's satellite terminals around the world. So if, we're in the Middle East, and let's say, just going back to the Iraqi conflict, you could take out the ground terminals, but they could just as easily download that information from Thailand and send it via submarine cable. So are you going to blow up a terminal in Thailand? Hopefully not. Take out a submarine cable? Probably not. You could, but then there's multiple cables and there's multiple other ways of getting it there. So that's kind of a hard do to deny that information if you can't seal off the whole country in one form or another. So what are some of the previous space wars? I think I've seen about 10 of them since the 1970s. Well, 1960s, actually. I was working in Washington in the 70s, and I went to the Federal Communication Commission, Laurel, Maryland satellite station. That's where they check on interference to satellite systems. I don't know if they're still there. But they told me about an incident with the U.S. satellite, communication satellite, creatively called ComSat, and it started getting jammed. And it was jammed for multiple days. And what they did was change the attitude of the satellite and see where the strongest signal was coming. And they said, well, it was off the east coast of the United States. So they assumed it was a Russian trawler jamming the satellite. You know, why? I don't know. The other times I know I had I was in my 20s only, and I had a former NASA employee come work for us, and he told me that he was on the CSAT program. This was a NASA program that looked at wave height over the oceans. And he said when they turned it on, they said, oh my gosh, we can detect nuclear submarines at operating depth. It just sort of tweaked the waves slightly for miles, and it's like an arrow pointing to this is where the submarine's at. And so he claimed that they faked the death of that satellite. And you could see that online, and they say that's a conspiracy theory. I don't know one way or the other. I do know, though, when later on, decades later, when various labs were doing imagery, which is difficult, but you can do with compensated optics, where they have the actual optics are movable, and they have little actuators that move it and distort it, and they send up a laser beam, and it says, oh, this is what the atmosphere is doing to the image, and so they counter that so that they can get a better image. And then the image, I look at that and say, it looks like the thing's all bent out of shape, you know, like somebody attacked it. So I don't know, you know. And then in the mid 90s, every time Russia launched a missile that put up a satellite, it would fall into the brink. And every time US did the same, it would not work. And it almost looked like there was a tit for tat going back and forth between the two, taking out their systems. Now, again, I don't know if that's true or not. It just seems statistically that way. And of course, I mentioned the Iraqi conflict, and that's space war. If you're taking out the ground terminals, that's space war. There were other incidents that I can't really talk about. Someone told me about a Chinese attack on the NOAA satellite in the Southeast Pacific region, cyber attack. For what that's worth, I don't know. Now, I will show you later, I will mathematically prove through orbital dynamics that Russian GLONASS navigation satellites, their GPS, were attacked in 2014. It's in the physics. You can see that. And then I was in France last year, briefing the French Air and Space Force, and they told me about the major incident that happened in 2017 that caused the establishment of the Space Force. I mean, you look at it politically, the Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree on anything, but they could readily agree about the Space Force. And I could tell, you know, being in this business so long, usually there's like 2 or 3 job announcements per year for people like me who do these things. Now there's hundreds, if not thousands, and billions and billions of dollars being placed on overt space programs dealing with space war. Who knows, the covert programs are multiple times that amount. I can see a certain degree of nervousness in the US government, nervousness across the world and other governments where they're establishing their own space forces. You can just see that something big happened and they're just not talking about it. Now, I kind of mentioned this already, but there's really various ways to attack things in space. And there's actually specific military names: disrupt, deny, degrade, destroy. And you're getting more and more severe kinds of attacks. So disrupt is you're temporarily denying a capability, and you're only doing that for part of the system. So at least years ago, drones in Iraq were controlled from Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, outside Las Vegas. And they used Intelsat, an international satellite communication system, to bounce the signal from the drone to the air base, 8,000 miles away. So you don't really want to send a missile up and blow Intelsat if you want to deny that. You don't even want to do a cyber attack that destabilizes it or somehow makes it spin out of orbit or something like that, because you anger a lot of people around the world who are using other channels on that satellite system, and maybe even you are using other channels. So you need something that's called, it's surgical strike, and it's temporary, a few days, a few weeks. Many times you're just sending a message. There's a lot of the messaging been going on with these space incidents, attacks, space wars, whatever you want to call it. And so you get, okay, temporary but full elimination of the utility of that space system, permanent, partial, permanent, full, and there's certain, like, just delaying or even putting in false information. And important aspects are, the problem and the beauty of space is you're talking tens of thousands of kilometers away. It's very difficult to see what's happening. You don't have anti-satellite systems, ASATs, with big red stars painted on the side. Probably 90% of the parts are Western source parts. It's actually kind of hard to know who's attacking you and so forth. And maybe you see that's bad, but the other thing is that people on the street don't know these things are happening. So governments can show resolve and intent, government to government, without engaging the general populace, and they become all emotional about it. It's like the Falklands Island conflict. Did Great Britain really care about the Falkland Islands, or was it just an ego trip and their populace getting mad and all that? If that was done covertly somehow, people would have just let it lay. And that's what's been happening in space. And space is, and that's nothing new for space. A few months ago, I heard, again, all this is unclassified, I don't have any security clearances, that an American submarine had an incident with a Russian submarine in the Sea of Japan. And that's all and I don't know what that means, and you never hear more about it. So I think countries are just like children. They'll do anything they want just so that they can get away with it from their parents, and you can get away with submarines. If you believe the Hollywood hype about spies and so forth, you go to CIA headquarters and there's this whole wall of all the agents who died in service. Well, none of those caused wars. Nobody knows about it. Governments like keeping a lot of this stuff quiet. And in a sense, it's communications between them, seriousness, and so forth. So it's important to have, gee, your satellite just broke. It wasn't me, non-attribution. Plausible deniability. It's like, well, I wasn't there at the time, or we don't have that capability, or somehow you can have an excuse for the public consumption. Most governments know what's really happening. They're not dummies, but everyone's happy to be fat, dumb, and happy, and not really understanding these things. And the other emphasis then again was non-public, that you can get away with a lot of it. So the other thing is, in every single Space Force person I've talked to over the last 2-3 years, whether at the lieutenant or general officer level, only thinks tactically. And, that's kind of wrong. Space is global by definition. Whatever you do in space is going to have global consequences. You've got all kinds of political implications of what you do. People, unfortunately, are used to war on the ground. They're not used to war in space. There's a lot of things that can happen. And I don't see, and maybe it's buried somewhere, but I don't see anyone planning. They keep talking about, oh, this satellite, this inspector satellite's coming up close to me. It takes days and weeks to do it, and I'm going to counter and do this and that. Well, what if you had 50 anti-satellites coming at, all your critical targets? How are you going to react? How are you going to determine the intent? Is it command and control decapitation? Are you trying to deny imagery or communications? How do you figure what that is? And, I've been told by NCA sources that the U.S. is not going to counterattack until they know at least who did it, and probably even why. And so you might be sitting there and it's like, well, we're in this war with China over Taiwan and the Western Pacific. And suddenly some of our satellites start blinking out. Oh, it must be them, Well, maybe it's the Russians messing with you. Are you really sure? Do you really want to start a space war without really knowing where the anti-satellite came from? And some of the, at least in the old Air Force and probably the Space Force, since they're 99% Air Force, I think they live in Disney fantasy worlds. They say, oh, we see this satellite, this missile was launched, the satellite came off of it, we track it and all, we know where everything is and who owns it and all. And it's like, I think it's very easy to hide in space. And the absolute proof of that actually is if you download the Space Command satellite catalog, space object catalog, close to half of all of the 30,000, or maybe it's 40,000 now, plus objects up there, real satellites, debris, and so forth. Close to half of those are called analyst objects, meaning we're still thinking about it. We don't really know what they are, who owns them, so they really don't know what's coming up there. And there's all kinds of things you can do. I mean, it doesn't take much. The Europeans had a geopotential gravitational satellite called Gochi a few years ago. And it, looking at the gravitational wells and stuff, that the Earth is kind of lumpy, and they had to have it close as possible. And it was so close, it was dipping into the atmosphere where it had a little bit of stubby wings and so forth. And for 2.5 years, they used electric thrusters to keep it from falling out of orbit. Okay, what if you have a military? Well, you have, let's say, a civil satellite that some country launched, and they faked its death, and it really has military capabilities on it, and who can tell, and just before a conflict starts, it starts up its electric thrusters and starts thrusting all kinds of ways, and suddenly it's not Keplerian orbits. The algorithms won't work right to be able to track that, especially if you attempt that, let's say, over Antarctica, where we don't have sensors, and it comes up and it's called a UCT, uncorrelated target. We don't know what this is, and then suddenly, oh my gosh, I have 100 uncorrelated targets over the last 24 hours. Does that mean we're starting a space war or something? So I think it's very easy to mess things up. And for some strange reason, the military is getting very interested in the moon. I'm not really sure why, because in my day, no one cared about the moon. And talking about squirrely orbits up there, where you're talking about the three-body problem, I hear there's all kinds of crazy kinds of orbits you can do and all that. So that'll be a difficult thing. When you're dealing with human minds, they always can fool you. You can't sit there. The first way that you get defeated in a conflict is to think I know everything. I remember someone saying before, I think it was the 73 Arab-Israeli conflict, the head of Israeli security boasted that, say, if they fart in Cairo, I'll know about it. And the next day, all these Israeli forts on the east side of the Suez Canal had 90% casualties. I mean, the charge of the Light Brigade was, I think it was only 24% casualties or something. I mean, they were wiped out. The Egyptians took fire hoses and broke down the sand berms that were defending these forts, and they had some new Russian anti-tank rounds and all that. And so yet, there's so many instances in military history of weaker foes beating stronger foes because of surprise. And that's even easier in space because it's just so far away. And because we don't really have a history there to understand how things work. There's the physics is different. For example, people sit there and worry about this satellite coming close to you. And my definition of two objects being close, and maybe a threat, is what's the amount of fuel and the amount of time it takes to meet, let's say, be an anti-satellite, blow you up or tear you apart or something. And according to that definition, a satellite on the opposite side of the Earth from you is actually close, because if it's in the same altitude and inclination, it doesn't take much in the phasing burns to get close to you. So how do you illustrate that on a map, let's say, and understand the various threats coming against you? So I mentioned, space largely hidden from not only public view, but military view. And by that, I mean the Space Force, the Air Force can be doing a lot in space. There could be wars happening in space, and the Navy doesn't necessarily need to know about it. And, the services are always in competition with each other. Other governments around the world maybe don't know about it. Some do, some don't. There's a lot of easy ways to hide things. And then I mentioned the potential peacetime consequences. And then the other sort of rule here, I'm getting into doctrine, is NATO countries in Europe are getting more and more serious about war because of the Ukrainian conflict. And I'm sure getting more and more serious about space wars. And I don't know what they're doing, though. The French proudly told me about their mobile laser blinder that they can blind satellites and then turn up the power and destroy at least the optics trade. And I'm sure some countries have various things. I wouldn't put it past the Israelis to have something and all that. But certainly, U.S., Russia, China are busy in that area. But so let's say something happened in the Straits of Taiwan, and there's a war occurring there, and we might sit there and say, NATO allies, come help us. We're part of NATO or something like that. Well, just the physics of it, they can't shift assets, particularly if they're geosynchronous. It takes days and weeks to shift them over. Oh, by the way, I just used up 80% of my remaining fuel, meaning 80% of my lifetime is gone. And so the general rule, all these, I came up on my own, is that you got to fight with what you got there, right then and there. Allies probably aren't going to help too much. And so the question is, well, should we have our space defense assets concentrated over Europe or over Western Pacific? That's kind of the fighting the war in peacetime, trying to figure that out. So that's an issue. And the other thing is that the simulations I've done myself, that most space wars are over with in 24 to 48 hours. And so it's kind of maybe almost unstable, like nuclear war, that whoever shoots first wins, maybe. I don't know. Well, one should maybe simulate that more. But you can't just sit around there and scratch your head and say, gee, I don't know what happened. Did my satellite break because, my stereo breaks now and again, and just electronics break? Was it a solar flare, micrometeor? Was it human cause but unintentional? Someone accidentally came too close or something like that. But it was human caused and intentional. Well, what was the intent? Is that intent worth going to war over? Were they just showing how strong they were and tough and trying to influence something happening on the ground? Or are they about to take out all your space assets, which any clever adversary, let's say going against the United States, I would think before they start a war on the ground, a serious war, they would take out the eyes and ears in space so the U.S. can't figure out, build up of forces, where they're going, and so forth. And in order to do that, there's actually two basic ways. Again, getting back to the physics of orbits, that you can't just start maneuvering, let's say, this ASAT satellite that's been in orbit for years. You can't just start maneuvering anywhere in the orbit. There's only specific parts in the orbit you can start maneuvering it to be able to get close to this other specific target. And so those are kind of well known. One could even say choke points in space. And if one had good space domain awareness, and you could say, well, these are the known sort of choke points, jumping off points, if they want to attack our communication satellites, and they would probably be different comm satellites over the Pacific versus over the Atlantic, or if they want to take out imagery satellites, which are sun synchronous, different, 90 degrees plus inclination, so they follow the sun. Those are different methods of attacks, different ways to attack. And then, so if you can determine that he's spending weeks building up into these choke points, maybe you can frustrate that by attacking his ASATs or going to the United Nations and saying, boy, it looks like this guy's building up to attack us in space, which means he's about to attack on the ground. I mean, why else would you attack in space? It doesn't really matter ultimately, unless how it influences what's happening on the ground. So maybe what I'm getting at is there's a lot of people say, oh, you know what, wars in space. And I'm thinking, well, maybe that's where you want them. There's no humans there. I mean, if you got International Space Station, they have lifeboats, they can get out or whatever. That's really an issue, but there's no reason to attack that. You're just attacking equipment, not people. And if you, let's say, if you took out an adversary's capability in space, that might prevent them from even starting a war on the ground. So, we have to think these things through. I've always said we need a new think tank to try to go hash out these various principles. And notice they're all strategic, diplomatic. They're not necessarily, oh, here's this cool technique to use this laser to melt this satellite. That's cool and, useful, but only useful under certain circumstances, certain orbits, certain political circumstances, certain escalation levels that you're at, and so forth. Okay. I've done most of this, and I take it people still see my charts and so forth, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You never know the internet cut off or something like that. So I've been already kind of expanding on this. There's various means of attacking space systems, and I'm going to start kind of at the bottom. There's diplomatic economics. Russia and China for years were trying to get anti-satellite treaties because they knew the US had more than they. And now they don't talk about it so much because they've been developing their own systems. But that's a form of attack, trying to limit a country's ability to develop these systems, at least publicly, or test them and so forth. And so there's various diplomatic, economic, don't let them get certain key technologies, parts, integrated circuits, optics, lasers, or whatever you want to see. Make sure you can restrict that. I mean, sooner or later they'll get it, but you're restricting it, and delaying their ability. And I'm showing you some of these potential anti-satellite systems. I mean, this is a sticky bomb that was proposed years ago. It's a high-powered microwave. And I don't know how it sticks, but supposedly it would stick against a satellite and go poof and fry all the electronics. This is test lasers here in Albuquerque going out into space. There's various concepts of laser systems. I mean, I mentioned the French one that can certainly, some of these are able to take out drones and missiles, and I think even airplanes now, especially on Navy ships and so forth, with a little better optics and stability and so forth. They probably could take out satellites, sure enough. I mean, I have a 7-watt laser I bought on Amazon that will start your furniture on fire across the room in less than a second. Now, that's not good enough to point in space. You got to really be able to point it right, and it's probably had a poor optical figure and all that. But research lasers at universities, certainly, and if they know where the satellite's at and they get a return signal or something like that. And so what I'm kind of showing here is that even smaller countries can have lasers. All countries have very clever young people who are cyber hackers, and that's the favorite thing to use, cyber attacks for space nowadays. And so going into that, you could, the classic jamming, spoofing, maybe somehow you can send false information on there, hijack the satellite. People worry about, hackers taking over a satellite and ramming it into another satellite. And I think that's kind of near impossible. I mean, you can make it drift around the geo belt or something like that and hope that maybe it would hit something. But you're talking about hyper velocities up there. And it's the classic Star Wars of a bullet hitting a bullet. And so the satellite has to have end-game sensors, some sort of optics radar to adjust its orbit to get the target. They have to have fine veneer engines to do that kind of adjusting. It has to have processors, quick processors to, figure that all out. It's got to identify the target. If you're, let's say, in sun synchronous orbit, they all bunch up because they want to be over the Earth about 10:30 in the morning for shadow control. You sure you're attacking the right satellite? So you can't just take any old dumb satellite and say, I'm going to send it against this other one, because space is really big, And then I'm showing you some of these other things. This is a picture and a simulation, I think, of a laser blinding. Now notice it hasn't taken out the whole picture unless it's powerful enough to bloom inside the optics trains and so forth. These are classic pictures of lasers in space. To my knowledge, no one's doing that. But if you've got these manipulator RPO, rendezvous proximity operation satellites coming close, it doesn't take much to put a little cyber weapon on there. It doesn't take much to put a little laser to destroy some of its sensors. Even if it's not an imagery satellite, you can destroy its Earth limb sensors, its star sensors. I mean, I even thought, boy, if you go up there and you show it a star map that's upside down, would you flip the satellite? I don't know. I have this whole book on satellite failures, and it's amazing how engineers believe in perfection. And these satellites say, oh, I didn't know it would point towards the bright moon and messed up the satellite, or I didn't know it would do this. And most of the time, they actually don't know what happened. And it takes them months to estimate what happened. Well, if the space war is over in 24 hours, you're out of luck. And quite frankly, you self-deterred. You're saying, I don't know what's happening, and I'm a good guy. I don't want to start a space war on my own. And suddenly, God, all my equipment's dead up there. I don't know what happened. And, I used to go to the NORAD Cheyenne Mountain Complex, for nuclear war there in Colorado Springs. And I asked him once, well, what happens if suddenly you lose all communication outside of the Cheyenne Mountain? And he says, well, first thing we do is call Ma Bell to see what the problem is, And there wasn't any, klaxons ringing and we're going to war now and all that. It was just sort of, well, whatever. And I see that even more so with space people. I don't know if that's been changing. Any rate, so I mentioned cyber. There's things to kill satellites. As a matter of fact, getting ahead of myself, and I'm looking at the time, recently in the war in Ukraine, it's presumed Russian cyber attacks went against Viasat. It's a communication satellite, and they destroyed 10,000 modems on the ground. It didn't go against the satellite, it went against the ground terminals. And the interesting thing here is the word destroyed. I didn't know a cyber weapon can physically destroy a piece of equipment. And windmills in Europe had problems because they couldn't communicate and all this. There was collateral damage, I guess. So you could do the same in space. If you've got this imagery satellite and you can get in cyber-wise, maybe you can change it so that the satellite points at the sun and destroys its imager, or move its heat exchangers, which are always pointing to the deep, dark, cold of space, If you make it point towards the sun, you'd probably burn up the satellite too. Maybe you can make it start spinning wildly where they can't get control of it anymore. Or maybe make it burn up all its reserve fuel on there. And so the satellite's worthless if it can't maneuver around a little bit to adjust its orbit and be able to point its antennas precisely. I mean, these are just things off the top of my head that are relatively easy, that aren't creating debris. Now, directed energies, which is lasers, high-powered microwaves, you know, I mentioned to blind the satellites and turn up the power. You can do some destruction. I guess there's a possibility of debris, but that's less so. And then getting back to the ground systems, there's physical attacks, you know, just blow the hell out of the target. Special forces going in, maybe just taking out the power, or putting in a high-powered microwave weapon in a fire extinguisher inside that goes poof, and then all the electronics are burned. I mean, I'm showing these other pictures. This is a Defense Meteorological Satellite Program, DMSP, in the factory, and somebody didn't bolt it down, and I don't know, the satellite's probably ruined. Now, was that an attack of a cleaner purposely did that? I mean, I'm just saying that. I don't have any evidence. It probably was just accidental, but that's a space warfare when you really think about it. And here's all these kinetic kinds of things. These are what the manipulator servicing satellites. I drew some pictures myself of two maintenance satellites fighting it out. This was the original kinetic kill vehicle. Here's a satellite taking apart another satellite. Here's an actual, multiple degrees of freedom manipulator satellite. I think it's maybe NASA or something like that. So there's all kinds of things you can do, including painting the sensors, solar panels. If you paint the antennas, they wouldn't have a good RF figure. You probably have some way of painting radiators so they don't radiate so well and the satellite overheats. Or you have paints that electrolyze in the sun, and so a few days later they go away. So that's kind of a temporary kind of attack. I saw one study that these geosynchronous satellites are huge. If you just painted one small corner of the solar panels on that thing, it would make differential solar pressure on the satellite, and the thing would start slowly spinning out faster and faster in space. So you really can't sit there and say, I am defending my satellite and I know all the techniques and all that, because that's the first way to be defeated. Because humans are so clever, they'll always find a way. Okay, so some of the prime war-winning characteristics that I've already kind of mentioned. Space situational awareness, space domain awareness. And that's not only some radar or optical system seeing what's up there, it's doing something with the data. What does this mean? And so the algorithms, if you've got 40,000 objects up there spinning all over the place, how do you determine that one object that's suspicious and is about to take out a missile warning satellite system or something like that, previous to the start of nuclear war? So you've got to have ways to display this information. It's very easy to get surprised in space. It's very easy to not understand what's happening. I mean, I can just come off the top of my head. If you had, let's say, a low Earth orbit satellite at 0-degree inclination, which no one uses that because it doesn't cover much of the Earth, but let's say it's an ASAT, anti-satellite. Now, all you have to do is increase its altitude, which doesn't take too much fuel, and you could take out the whole LEO belt going up and down. Nobody has sensors at the equator. Would they even see that coming? Would they even see it's there? How about all those 1960s rocket boosters, that sent satellites up the geosynchronous belt? They're still floating around there in geotransfer orbits. And, the rocket exhaust cones are the size of rooms. Well, you could hide an anti-satellite in there for years. No one's going to go take an inspector and use all that fuel up to go there. When it comes over some dry area where there's no sensors like the South Pacific, it can maneuver out of there. you guys have probably heard of RAM, radar absorptive materials. Well, NASA a few years ago invented optical absorptive materials, so that the main way you detect things in space is optical. The radars don't go far enough, really. So you could really make this thing dark. And I saw yet another study called Smart Attitude. You see a satellite's a box, the sun hits against the side of it, and that reflects off into the Earth, and it looks bright. So you can track it. Well, what if you just change the attitude so that all the solar speculars reflect off into deep space? You're suddenly at 18th magnitude for brightness, besides using any sort of NASA, optical absorptive materials. Here's an actual patent from, I think it was the 1970s, for a stealth satellite, kind of a barbell. I guess it's solar panels or something. You can look that up online. I don't know how they can do it, but they seem to think 50 years ago you could do it that way. So at any rate, surprise is easy. Pre-conflict positioning is everything. And that's hard because you're predicting what war is going to happen and who the adversary is going to be 10 years from now. Because, satellites last 10, 15 years. So you're only able to fight what's available in the local region of space. Maneuverability is everything. If you can maybe try to get away, I doubt you can do that. But if someone's coming at you, that'd be good. Or if you start scattering on warning, the war started and suddenly all my satellites start maneuvering. And if I got enough fuel to do that, that's good. So maneuverability is everything, maybe even refueling depots in orbit, but that would be prime targets. And then command decisiveness. That's true of everything, whether it's ancient battles or future space wars. And the trouble is if you don't have this situational awareness, you don't have this decisiveness, plus not sure how the command and control is nowadays. I doubt it. A military general can start a space war. He probably needs national command authority approval and so forth. So, we'd have to see how that works out. Okay, let me talk about space escalation. And maybe I'll just hurry a little longer because I only have half an hour left. Space, I believe, provides additional rungs on a conflict escalation ladder because you can't really see what's happening. There's a certain degree of acceptability. Since the 1950s, we agree, well, satellites can overfly countries because we can't really change their orbits, and that's just the way it is. So that's kind of good that it provides additional rungs, that maybe you have a ground conflict and you show resolve in space, which happened in 2014. I'll get to it. And I mentioned this before, space provides a forum where you can show these actions, and it's sort of like a way to blow off steam, maybe. And that's what happened in 2014. So other things, can a war in space cause a war on the ground, or vice versa? That's hard to think. That's why I keep saying we need a space warfare think tank to start thinking some of these things out, before we spend billions on weapon systems that the politicians and the State Department are not going to let you use ultimately because of political circumstances. You better have that kind of figured from the beginning. And then this whole concept, there's a Joint Chiefs of Staff publication called JP 5-0, and it's geniusy in it, really. It's how the U.S. fights wars, and it goes down through all this. But the geniusy to me is they say, well, before you start any planning, before you start redistributing forces and this and that, you write down what the surrender criteria are, the termination criteria for the conflict. Capture the capital, depose the government, destroy war-making goods, I don't know, for the terrestrial. Well, what are those for space? There's no capital you're taking out. I suppose you could be destroying war material if you even know where they're at. You're going to go around and inspect all 40,000 objects in space, you're not really sure. There's also the thing of conceivably both sides can claim they won the space war. One side could say, well, I took out all your communication satellites. And the other guy, no, I took out all your imagery satellites. Well, what's better? I don't know. It depends on the kind of war, the kind of leaders. Do they really use and trust that imagery information? Are they militaries like the US, where if suddenly forces get out of communication with headquarters, they still do their job, but maybe in more authoritarian regimes, they don't, because they don't want to get lined up and shot. So these things, you know, again, there's bigger issues. It's not like I got this laser and I know what to do with it. And if you have this briefing, you can click on these various buttons and I'll show you my full briefing. I think I came up with 50 or 60 different potential war termination criteria. And then I've already mentioned this, that maybe fighting wars is better in space than on the ground. I mean, it's sort of like, I think there's some treaty, you know, oh, you can't find a war in Antarctica. Well, gee, I don't know. I could be Machiavellian about it and say, well, no one's living there. Probably it's a perfect place to fight a war. Who cares, you know? And the same with space. So, you know, let's not be childish about this. There's no human casualties. There's no cities destroyed, you know, what's happening in Ukraine and so forth, you know, and there's various techniques that don't create debris. And it takes many years to recoup, you know, satellites in space. It takes, you know, a 10-year program to design, to build them, to launch them, months to check out. They're there for 10 or 15 years. I mean, you've significantly reduced an adversary's capability in the midterm if you're successful in a space war. Okay. Now, the other problem is if it can get a space war over with in 24 hours, it's kind of a hair trigger. And you know, if you're not certain, you might push that button wherein, you know, a lot of people talk about, well, I'm going to defend this satellite. And if something's coming close, I'm going to shoot back, blah, blah, blah. And I look at the actual orbital dynamics, and I see that, gee, just with the orbits, satellites come close to each other all the time. You know, it's just, that's the way it is. And I've got a whole graph on that shows that happens, you know, many times a week. Are you going to have some automatic intelligence system that when that satellite's over Antarctica, it sees a threat and it shoots down that other satellite, and you find out the other satellite was just harmlessly coming by? You know, I doubt we're going to allow that to. I hope we don't. So it's very maybe unstable. And that's why situational awareness is everything. I suppose having depth of defense. Oh, you killed 20 of my satellites. Well, I have 40 back here, and so it didn't really matter. And they were hidden in space. I'm going to bring those out and look around and wait. What happened? You know, who did that? What should I do? Should I do something on the ground instead of in space? And you know, it gives you a few more days to kind of try to figure out. Okay. And here's some potential space war termination criteria. You know, reducing the ability of the red side to fight wars in space, maybe reducing its ability to see the battlefield with 1 meter or less resolution. You know, there's a lot of things you could think of. Hard to figure. And I'm not sure what, if at all, the Space Force has termination criteria for space. I think they just keep thinking of, well, somebody told me to take the satellite out, so I did it, without really thinking of why and when. And we're taking out this satellite because it's supporting this ground operation happening in the next 24 hours, and we want to deny his ability to do that. And define taking out: temporary, surgical, permanent, debris, not debris, you know. So to summarize, how to win. No, it has space situational awareness, space domain awareness, whatever you want to call it, that dominates. Pre-conflict positioning, decisive political will, effective doctrine, whatever that is. I have some ideas, but we haven't fought a major space war, so who knows, you know. And then how you even define winning, and then how to lose a space conflict. Uncertainty, confusion, self-deterrence. Oh, we got all these great assets, but they're over Europe, and we happen to be fighting in the Western Pacific. Tough luck. Have you really thought of the future political impacts? Won the space battles, lost the war, lost the peace. And in some sense, you can have your satellite systems, most of them, denied by the adversary's ability to take out your ability to receive that information on the ground. Okay, let me show you an example of a space war. This is the timeline in 2014, and I have the various blue attacks and red attacks. And this is you can click on here, and this will link to various newspaper accounts. So the conflict started in 20 February in earnest. I mean, they were messing for a long time before that. And they have this newspaper article says the Ukrainians tried to jam and attempted to decay the orbit of a Russian communications satellite. Now, I'm not really sure what that meant, because if it's a geosynchronous satellite, you're not going to decay its orbit. But maybe if you spun it out or made it start maneuvering somewhere wildly, that could be. So that was a space attack, one way or the other. And then the one that I will prove to you, the Russian GLONASS system, which is their GPS, had a system-wide failure of all 24 satellites for 13 hours. I'll go over that. And then, and my theory here is that it was, in some sense, a diplomatic attack. I mean, I'm not sure how useful GLONASS is in Ukraine, where it was Russian territory. Everyone knows where everything's at. You know where the roads are at and all that. I don't know how navigation helps you that much. It was sort of showing resolve and intent. And it looks like the message didn't get through. So 2 weeks later, there were another 8 satellites failed, however. And then in April, a ballistic missile early warning satellite was lost. Now that could be natural, and that's dangerous, actually. Those should be the one objects in space that you don't touch. Because if an adversary wants to start a nuclear war, the first thing he's going to do is take out the missile warning satellites so that the adversary can't see what you're doing, which missiles are being launched towards what targets and so forth. So you shouldn't get even near anyone else's ballistic missile warning satellites, because that might be an indicator that you intend to go to nuclear war and show the wrong intent. But that could have just been natural. I say question mark. And now this is what I say. This is a red attack. Russia was launching astronauts, American astronauts and probably European, to the International Space Station. And the head of the Russian Space Agency said, well, now you can use a trampoline to get up there. Well, that's a diplomatic, economic attack. It's a threat. Warfare is all about threats and working out those threats. And again, going back to the ancient Greek, making them change their ways. So that was an attack. Okay, 16th May, this is my favorite. A Russian launch vehicle that was carrying a brand new telecommunication satellite that would have covered the eastern Ukraine. It crashed on a Chinese village just as Putin was in Beijing selling Russian space capabilities. So I can't prove that, but that sounds remarkably circumstantial. And then there's a bunch of other satellites that gave up the ghost. This is interesting. A European Galileo, which is their GPS navigation system, had a launch failure. It happened to be on a Russian Soyuz rocket from Guyana in South America. Who knows if that was another message being sent, since this war seemed to be about navigation satellites. And then what happened? The US was having a grand old time in space, and they were, I could prove, at least hacking GLONASS satellites and probably others. And I'm sure there wasn't a Space Force then, but the Air Force people were gleefully saying, look at all this cool stuff we did. Russia got PO'd, and they attacked the American banking system. Look it up. 5 different banks in Manhattan were hacked. They said at the time, looked like it was coming from Russian servers. Tens of millions of bank accounts, stock accounts were hacked. And then a few days later, you heard nothing more about it. But suddenly, Obama stopped talking bad about the Russians in Ukraine. And a week later, there was a peace treaty signed, sort of. And so I interpret that, and you can't just trust what's said in the news. I interpret that as the U.S. won in space, but ultimately lost the war on the ground because of a cyber attack. So you got to think of this combined arms approach, like the Army does, that you're just not doing a laser or this or cyber. How does it all integrate together? And how does it integrate together with possible other means of coming against you? So let's go over the physics of this 2014 attack. And I see I have 15 minutes left. This was published in Great Britain. This is Great Britain here, English Channel, navigational map, I guess. And this is location of a user using a GLONASS handheld receiver. And it's telling him that he's not located there. It's telling him he's located 40 kilometers away in different random places. So GLONASS sites were attacked temporarily, obviously a cyber attack. And they somehow messed with the atomic clock or something. I don't know how it happened, but this is definite. This is what they saw. Now, if you're an airplane using Russian GLONASS systems, gee, I don't know about how that would work. So let's look at the physics. So this was published. This is the date and time that these various GLONASS satellites here started blinking out, losing capabilities, you know, about this time. And I said, well, gee, I'm a rocket scientist. I have my orbital dynamics software. Let's see where these particular satellites were over the Earth at that particular date and time. So, okay, I put it in, and lo and behold, every time a Russian satellite, GLONASS satellite, came over Alice Springs, Australia, it started blinking out. Now, we're really talking about Pine Gap. Look it up on the internet. NSA listening site since the 1960s. There's been 3 Australian movies about the place. And so starting exactly 6:30 in the morning, whenever a satellite, GLONASS satellite was overhead, it stopped working. And if there were several GLONASS satellites overhead, it would start working in numerical order, GLONASS 1, 2, and 3. So it was obviously intentional. And, you know, I've kind of been at these places. I can see, well, they come in at 6 a.m., they get their coffee. At 6:15, they start testing this anti-satellite cyber weapon system. And then at 6:30, they push the button and started all attacking. I mean, it's too obvious, quite frankly. And this is another way of looking at it, a flat map view from Alice Springs and the various orbits of the GLONASS satellites. Here, one of them was covering Ukraine just before it came over Alice Springs. And this is showing you the timeline when they would have coverage. And this is showing you, you're at Alice Springs in the center here, looking up, and azimuth elevation plots these satellites. There's 3 of them coming over overhead at the correct date and time that they actually went out. And this is just a supposition. The United States will gladly tell you about their counter communication system. It's on the internet. Here's the pictures. Part of the 4th Space Control Squadron. They're actually based here in New Mexico, down in Alamogordo. I don't know where they were at in 2014, or if there was some other system that was transported to Australia to start doing these attacks. So that's all theoretical. Except definitely something human intentional happened at that date and time. And this is just a Google Maps look of Pine Gap and all of the antennas and so forth. So conclusions. The failures of 7 Russian space systems over 4 months was statistically unusual. You know, that's kind of the best you can do. Except for these GLONASS attacks, physics-wise, I can prove that happened. And then, you know, mathematically, maybe from the counter communication system. The other attacks are circumstantial, and again, I'm getting that emphasized, the beauty of space. If you shoot down an aircraft, they can look at the wreckage, they can look at the wreckage of the missile, they can maybe even see the trail of the missile going up. there's all this evidence to say, yeah, you did it and it came from here. But in space, even if you had a satellite that you blew up, it's like, I don't know who did it. You know, it came over Antarctica and then suddenly it didn't exist anymore. Or, gee, I don't know. Because that happens all the time. I mentioned the book I have of why did the satellite stop working? You know, I don't know. Let's try figuring it out. And it'll take a month or two to figure it out. That war's over with. So maybe the Galileo attack on the European system was a warning. After the attack on the American banking system, you know, I mentioned the war stopped. So the war was over with. I think they lost the space war because the Russians, you know, seized these millions of bank accounts and probably threatened to put them out on the internet or something like that if you don't stop what you're doing. That's theoretical. I can't prove that, but it's awfully circumstantial. So lessons learned. GLONASS attacks are too obvious. Somebody on the street like me shouldn't be able to figure it out. You know, there's a lot of orbital programs available free online that you can plug in these orbital elements and figure this stuff out. It doesn't take much, I don't think. This attack could have been from multiple places on Earth. They could have been on embassy rooftops. It could have been on ships in the South Atlantic. Space is global, you know. You could access it any place. Why do it in a somewhat obvious place? And this is lack of strategic thinking is what I'm noticing here. So it was too difficult to attack. Now, the other side of the coin is, though, if you're trying to send a message and the message is too obscure, and in Russia they can say, well, gee, all these GPS or GLONASS satellites started blinking out. Maybe it was solar flares, or maybe it was this. You know, some of the politicians would be uncertain. So if you're sending a message, it's got to be certain, and so it can't be too obscure, I guess. And so I'm mentioning this again. You know, you got to understand the bigger picture. It's always strategic, very political. There's terrestrial consequences. You got to think of combined arms. I mean, that might mean you do a jamming or a cyber attack against a satellite for a few hours or a few days so that you fix it in space so that the ground controllers can't start maneuvering it or going into defensive modes. And you're waiting for the real killer, you know, inspection satellite to come up and start tearing it apart or something like that. So combined arms. And then I always thought the State Department must be involved early on. I've been saying that for 35, 40 years. And I always get these blank stares from the Air Force saying, oh, we don't trust them. And I think, well, if you get them in on early on these programs, they might say, tweak it slightly this way, and it'll be more acceptable later on when the president and with inputs from the State Department and the military and all are trying to decide whether they're really going to let you do that mean thing. You know, now, just as an aside, I know a former Assistant Secretary of State who says, yeah, I understand why they don't trust them. The State Department in the United States, at least, loves any sort of space weapons treaties. They don't care how good or bad it is. They just love it anyway. So, you know, for what that's worth, there's always these tensions between different agencies and governments, and it's natural. Okay, what's happening today? Well, it's not like I have a crystal ball. There's probably things happening in space. I'm sure the inspector satellites are coming close to each other. China's watching what Russia and US is doing, and maybe they're doing some tweaking. I know what's been reported in the press, and that's like I mentioned, the Viasats had all kinds of service interruptions and actual damage to their modems because the Ukrainians were using it militarily. And to me, well, the Starlink, you know, Elon Musk saying, oh, we're just going to let Starlink satellites or their terminals, we're going to give them all these thousands of terminals to help in the conflict. Well, you're a commercial entity and you just became part of the kill chain. You know, does that, I think I mentioned earlier, the drones in Iraq controlled from Creech Air Force Base and Intelsat. Well, if there's a French satellite control center in France, controlling Intelsat, does it make that French control center a legal target because it's part of the kill chain? It's killing people in Iraq or whatever. I don't think, Elon Musk and people are really thinking this stuff through, guys, that you're playing in a war like a child and you're going to get burned one way or the other. So, there's various things like the Russian Space Agency refused to launch OneWeb satellites, which were on the pad already, or at least on the booster. These are British satellites because of the sanctions. And they said, well, now you don't get your, not only are we not going to launch it, you don't get your satellites back, And then there's a lot of things of malware going in and cyber attack. Everyone thinks cyber is cool and harmless and non-attribution. You can always claim, I didn't do it. But I do a thought experiment, and that is, let's say you're a soldier in the trench, and the adversary's starting up his tank engines, and then you start running over you, start coming towards you. And this egghead shows up with this black box with this big red button in the center, and he says, hey, I'm going to give you this box, and if you push that button, it'll cyber attack those tanks, mess up their computers, and they'll stop running. Unfortunately, we only had enough money for this cyber weapon, and we didn't have enough money for bazookas, anti-armor things. Which one do you really want? Now, as a basic human being, I think it's more emotionally satisfying to see a smoking hole in the ground when this tank is coming at me than to see this guy claim the cyber attack's going to work, and it stops the tank for 30 seconds. They reboot the computers, and then it runs over me. So cyber sounds clean and all that, but I don't know when it really comes to space. Okay, you got this briefing. These are different other briefings by myself. I have this space warfare discussion group, close to 21,000 members now. If you're welcome to come aboard, just send me your name, email address, what company you work for, and so forth. So I am open for questions, and I believe I'm on time.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful presentation. We do have some questions. So with your permission, I would be taking them up.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So we have our first question. Sir, can we possibly see the weaponization of space debris by certain state or non-state actors? That's our first question.
Can I possibly see what?
The weaponization of space debris by certain state or non-state actors.
Yeah, I mean, if you could, and again, I'm fantasizing here. I'm no, diplomatic expert, but I could see like North Korea, which has some launch capability, I think, creating debris clouds because they say, oh, the heck with the rest of the world. We don't care anyway. We're in the hermit kingdom. Or shooting a nuke up in space, which would destroy a lot of satellites through increased radiation. So, I could see that. The thing about debris is I think it takes weeks and months. I mean, space is just really big, and people don't think of that. And they see these pictures of these satellites, and it looks really dense. But the satellites they're showing there are the size of cities. Satellites today are the size of a soccer ball. And if you said, okay, take this soccer ball and hide it somewhere on Earth and then challenge someone to find it, they say, oh my gosh, I can't find it. Well, think of the vastness of space and what is it, R squared rule, that it's even more vast between the Earth and the moon, and it's just all this territory. And yeah, there's a lot of crap up there, and bad things do happen. But if you just blew up another thing that's wrong, I think, they think, oh, well, this is all this debris is in this one orbit. But if you're in the same orbit, you and the debris just stand there and it doesn't go anywhere. The debris needs velocities, and you'll get some other velocities and things like that. But it's not like you see in the Hollywood movies where it's going to be coming at you and all that. Now, maybe if it's at different inclinations and this and that, I guess maybe I'm poo-pooing this thing of debris, and it's a problem, and yes, you can get too much, and you really shouldn't be doing that. And I think like China did its anti-satellite test created a lot of debris, and they really haven't since. I think they kind of learned their lesson. It's evolving countries seem willing to do it, and the U.S. did that too with its F-15 ASAT and the launch from the Navy ship against that nuclear satellite. So emerging countries seem to think that's the easiest thing to do, but I think there's other techniques, especially if you get these manipulator satellites, and especially if companies are building them for you. Seems to me a country, like, I don't know, UAE or India or whatever, could buy some, and there's amateur astronomers. They pool their money together and they buy these automated telescopes. They're 30 or 40,000, and they put them in some mountain area or something like that. And then they go on the internet and do their astronomy kind of things. Well, it seems to me a country can spend a few $1 million, buy 10 or 20 of these, put them at embassies around the world, and they have their own space surveillance network. And they understand where satellites are and who's maneuvering. And, oh, look at this Russian inspector satellite coming close to NRO satellite, and a lot of those things would have great diplomatic value, if nothing else, if you could tell if a space war is starting before most people know it, So somehow that's all related. Okay, next question.
All right, so we have a next question. Won't the space conflict between two nation states likely have a not related third country's sovereign assets as the collateral? What can be possibly done to prevent such kind of escalations?
I'm sorry, so tell me again,
Okay,
what is
so
the
basically,
escalation?
so basically the question is, won't the space conflict between two nation states, the space conflict between two nation states, likely have a not related third country's sovereign assets, which they are not including as the collateral? So what can be possibly done to prevent such kind of escalations? When a conflict is going on.
It's certainly, it's true, and it's something that should be studied, that conflict between two nations might involve others accidentally or maybe purposefully. It depends how serious the third country wants to squawk about it. If there's some major war between two major powers, and even let's say it was a nuclear war or something like that, some third world country is going to kind of like, these guys are willing to blow up and kill a lot of people. I think I'm not going to complain at the moment. It's not worth it. But certainly that can happen. Now, it's the old thing. How do you prevent war? Gee, we've been trying to do that for thousands of years, I guess. And are you going to prevent a war in space? How are you going to prevent it spilling over? Well, this is, why I've been pushing. Space is global. You might think your theater of operations is the Western Pacific, but if you're taking out LEO and MEO satellites, low Earth orbit, that affects the rest of the orbits around the Earth, and especially if you're making debris, or even if you didn't make debris, you did a really good job. You prevented that satellite from working evermore, you burned it out or something like that. Well, it's still a piece of space junk that ultimately might hit somebody. I think there's like a UN treaty that says the launching country is responsible for damage from its launching systems, their satellites and so forth. So if the US launched a satellite from Africa, I guess, and the African satellite does something wrong, I don't know if the U.S. is legally liable according to that treaty, but I'm not a lawyer, kind of thing. So they have these certain liability things. I don't know if there's some sort of codicil, little fine print that says, however, if it's wartime, you can do anything you want, And there's treaties, UN treaties saying you can't have weapons of mass destruction in space. Okay, great. Well, the Russians had, I guess in the 70s or maybe 60s, FOBs, Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. and they would send an ICBM up in space, going south, and it would attack the U.S., theoretically, from the south, where we didn't have our distant early warning, do radar systems to detect it happening. And they said, well, it's only partial orbit. So it really wasn't in orbit, really wasn't in space. So, you know, you're always going to have the lawyers playing those games. But yeah, it could affect other people. Though that's also true of how many people are affected by the conflict in Ukraine, you know, around the world, economically, diplomatically, even militarily, and so forth. So I guess that'd be just as true in space. Next.
Okay, we have our next question. As compared to the land warfare, space war usually would not involve any human casualty. So, can we expect frequent space wars in the future once other countries also develop space warfare capabilities? So, how can we ensure that states respect space treaties?
I'm not even sure of nuclear treaties. They say, oh, you're only going to have so many nuclear weapons. Well, who knows if you've got buried in a mountain somewhere some other nuclear weapons. So, you know, treaties, and then that's even worse in space, that you can't really figure this. Oh, look at this satellite. It, looks dead, but maybe it has some secret capabilities on it. Well, let me tell you a story. A few months ago, a Chinese Badao satellite, a geosynchronous orbit, that's their navigational satellite system. They came in with one of their manipulator satellites and grabbed a hold of it and pulled it to graveyard orbit, to get it out of the way. It's been drifting for years. And, that's what's reported in the press. And, I've done this for so long and I know where the skeletons are buried. And I said, no, I think what really was is that they faked its death of this Badao satellite when it was first launched years ago. It was drifting around the geobelt. It was inspecting other satellites. Maybe it had some weapon capabilities. And 2 days after the U.S. launched one of its own inspector satellites, the Chinese are pulling this out of orbit to be good guys. Only it wasn't really graveyard orbit. Graveyard orbit is 300 kilometers plus or minus geosynchronous. They pulled it to 3,000 kilometers. And that's a lot of extra fuel, and fuel is everything in space and all that. So I interpret it, and I don't have proof, that it was a suspicious system and they wanted to get it out of the way of the American inspector satellites. So was that suspicious system violating a treaty? How can you really tell if you don't have inspectors? I mean, even the nuclear treaty had on-site inspectors. The Russian planes used to come in and land at Kirtland Air Force Base here in New Mexico and inspect something. So that's a hard thing to say, and I'm sorry I can't give you an absolute answer on that, but it's human nature that if they, getting back to like children, if they can get away with it, they will. And let's not be children about this. We understand that's how it works, and that's how it works on the ground too, guys, and that's how it's going to work in space. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. So we have our next question. Sir, you mentioned that political will is necessary to win a space war. Space war requires uniformity and quick decision making. So are countries like Russia and China in a favorable position to win space wars as compared to the democratic countries, where there may be hesitation and political restrictions to useful potential to fight a space war? So how can democracies around the world deal with the space war threats from non-democratic countries, basically Russia and China?
I mean, yeah, that's an intelligent question, and I wonder about that myself. That if an adversary, and let's say even if it was a democratic adversary, had already decided to do space war, maybe it took them years to decide, and they developed it, and they say, we're really going to do it. They had the time, where the recipient of those attacks has only hours to make a decision, And yes, it does sound like dictatorships, autocratic things would be better at that. Is that true, on the ground too, with military, tanks and planes and ships? So I mean, you're right. It almost sounds that, but let's talk about it. Tell me I'm wrong or something. Maybe there's some other factors. I mean, I could look at another factor that autocratic regimes don't allow troops to make their own decisions as much as, let's say, democratic ones do. So that's kind of a vulnerability if you cut off command and control. I know there's things, the different cultures have different ways of doing things. I heard something that the Russians, their doctrine was, oh, yeah, we don't mind blowing up American satellites, taking them out, however, because it gives them a military advantage on the ground. And we don't think there's anything wrong with that. But we only get to blow up enough satellites so that the ground war is evened out. And then we stop blowing up satellites. It's like, what? Kinds of things. So how does that all work ultimately with the different cultures? Yeah, it could be a vulnerability, and I don't have a solution. But, tell me, guys, give me other ideas here.
Yes, sir. We have 3 questions from Mr. Praveen Pradeep. The first one is, are existing missile warning satellites capable of tracking hypersonic weapons? How do you view the developments of directed energy weapons in space?
Well, wait a minute. One question at a time. So
Okay.
can they...
Okay, the first question is, are existing missile warning satellites capable of tracking hypersonic weapons?
That I don't know about the specific programs, and it's probably classified. I know that they are able to, track large explosions besides nuclear, and I think afterburners of aircraft. So they're probably used tactically in that way. I don't know if a hypersonic, if the thing is heating up so much that they can do, track the heat and all that. Sorry, I can't really answer that. And if I really knew the answer, it probably would be classified. The second question.
Yes, sir. How do you view the developments of directed energy weapons in space?
Well, I've been on programs for many years for that. And certainly to be able to shoot a laser beam thousands of kilometers away, space to space, I guess sounds effective. The thing is do you really know the material properties of that satellite? Is it mirrors or whatever? That you've got to really do the research on and understand and hope. Now, directed energy for blinding, for systems that detect optical energy, imagers and all that. Yeah, that would work. Though space to space, you'd have to kind of get below it, I guess. So that's effective, and probably less chance of debris, though you might be melting things on that. The other thing is getting in position. Just because you've got this wham bam, space power, high power laser, something in space. First of all, it's really a juicy target for your adversaries, and you probably need several of them to be able to get to the other satellites in time. They're awfully big, so you can kind of see them coming, so to speak. Now, if you had like a small pea shooter, like I said, I have 7-watt laser I can hold in my hand, you can certainly put that on a satellite that's coming close to you and maybe do some damage. Now, there's the other question of, ground-based lasers. And, countries are very interested in that. I know Russia complained years ago about tests of, I think it was the Miracle laser in southern New Mexico, and they were just testing. I haven't heard much from them for years, so I don't know if that program's still around. The trouble is, you got to worry about clouds and weather and stuff like that. But the real trouble is, if you want to sweep the skies, I'm taking 20, 30, 40 satellites out, it takes about 30 days for them to come overhead to do that. Now, is that enough military time? Well, at least in a few years ago, we always thought wars would be quick. It hasn't been quick in Ukraine. Is that good, doable? Maybe. Is that worth billions of dollars of building it? I don't know. You'd have to do a simulation on that. But it all sounds cool. The lab here has worked with high-powered microwaves too. I don't know where they ever gotten with that, besides frying some soldiers in Afghanistan with it. Yeah, that's about all I can say about it at the moment.
All right. So the next question is, do you view existing doctrines having sufficient concept of operations?
No, hell no. I know it. I've worked with these guys. Now, I have to admit, I'm not familiar with the latest in the last 6 months, years, Space Force. If they really have done some good doctrine. Like I said, everyone I've talked to, from lieutenant to literally general officers, I'm on the general officer steering group here at the lab, just think tactically. None of them seem to think these bigger pictures, which I don't know, it seems obvious to me. And I hope I can somehow put that in there, but I see no interest in that. And so maybe it takes a few more years to expand and grow. I mean, they spent the first year or two just figuring organizations, and maybe they're still doing that. My theory is, and I mentioned this several times, that we need to establish like a space warfare think tank, like Rand Corporation or stuff like that, to invite in senior people, retired general officers, politicians, and all that, and start hashing out some of these questions of how this would come down and what we really want to do in space. And for example, too, getting back to the doctrine, I mentioned this Joint Chiefs of Staff JP Pub 5-0. I don't think anyone in space has ever followed that pub that's been around for decades. Not in the command centers I've been in. They just think, oh, we're just different, Now there's some joint command centers, because, ultimately space is there for the ground. So I've been to about 15 different military exercises that were dealing with space. And I was astounded that, you always fight the last war. And at one point, years ago, we were fighting the Iraqi conflict from the 90s again, but with space questions. And they had, the Russians, no, I guess it was a few years later. It was the Chinese anti-satellite, and we were modeling that in the conflict. And they said, well, okay, this Chinese anti-satellite ASAT's coming up and it's going to attack the satellite. And I said, well, okay, why don't we do something where there's two ASATs on the same booster? The one goes in to attack the target. The other one hangs back and, looks to see if he needs to go in to increase the probability of kill, or he just finds out in the debris cloud and floats away later when he's out of view of space surveillance assets. And the colonel in charge of exercises said, you can't do that. And it's like, well, why not? There's nothing technologically wrong with that. It's called being clever. And when people are about to die, let's say 1.4 billion Chinese people are about to die, they're going to get very clever. And that's been true throughout history. So it's kind of the wrong thinking. And then the other side of the coin, a different exercise, and unfortunately another Air Force colonel, I said, well, here's a strategy. We purposely destroy all of the ground terminals, the heavy earth terminals in country. I think it was another Iraqi recap. But purposely lightly damage one of them and go in 6 to 12 hours later with anti-personnel weapon to take out the technicians, especially at the time they were German technicians. Because that is the ones that count, not the equipment, but the intelligent guys who know how to fix it and run it and stuff like that. And he was horrified. Like, you're killing space personnel? That's, forbidden. And it's like, well, we're at war. Thousands of people are dying, and you've got a, uniform on and, be a part of the conflict. So there was this, for years, this NASA mentality that, I've heard lip service saying, oh, well, we're warfighters now. And blah, 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 but then I was talking to a general friend a few years ago who was in charge of training the people in Colorado Springs, the Space Force people. And I said, well, Well, do you talk to your guys who are running these satellites and maybe even space systems? You talk to him about like the political consequences and this and that, and his response was, "Oh, they don't know about that stuff. We don't let them worry about that." And then I think of, well, the Army, they are taught that. They're taught that if they go in this village and they're fighting, if there's CNN cameras, news cameras there, be aware of that and be aware of what you do. Be aware of space treaties, rules of engagement, laws of armed conflict, all of this stuff. And it just seemed to me a poor attitude of, oh, we're just here to blow up satellites. And it's like, well, have you ever asked why you're blowing it up? Because you're really not blowing up the satellite. You're denying a capability. By the way, if you're taking out that imagery satellite, you better have someone else coordinating taking out the drones who are giving the same information, or the guy on a camel with binoculars. You're trying to deny that information, and space is only one way of doing that. So, yeah, I think the doctrine's really poor and probably continuing to be. And I have seen no indicators that are different. And, I'm not there at the secret classified meetings. I'm not located in Colorado Springs. I could hope that something is coming up, but I just I cannot detect any of it occurring.
Okay, we have one last question. Can we consider ASAT testing and military exercise is a breach of OST, Outer Space Treaty?
I'm sorry, so again?
Okay, can we consider ASAT testing and military exercise is a breach of Outer Space Treaty?
No, I don't think so. It's weapons of mass destruction. You're testing nukes, yeah, which, the U.S. blew up a few nukes, I guess in the 60s in space, and over months, many satellites died from decreased radiation. But if you have, let's say, an inspector satellite, and you said, oh, no, NASA made this, and it's going around and it's repairing this satellite. And oh, by the way, on the way there, and I'm just talking theoreticals, on the way there, it had this secret little cyber package on it that sent this cyber code into a satellite along the way. And it's a Trojan horse just sitting there that we can utilize later or something like that. Now, is that against the Outer Space Treaty? If you can even verify it. No, it's not a weapon of mass destruction. It's kind of surgical. Even a direct ascent anti-satellite that has shotgun pellets, it sounds like a mass effect, but I don't think that's their definition of mass. Now, oh yeah, they got all these great treaties. And I really wonder, first of all, that say part of those treaties is you cannot put military bases, or you cannot own the moon or celestial bodies. Great. Well, most people don't understand there's, I think, 86 different countries around the world that never ratified that treaty. And it seems to me some SpaceX can get one of its barges, move to the economic zone of that country, launch something to the moon, and that country can declare ownership of the moon because they didn't sign that treaty, and then lease it back for 99 years to that company that launched for them. Now, space lawyers tell me, oh, you can't do that. And I'm thinking, well, what's the sense of signing a treaty if you're bound by it no matter what? So I don't know. But I'm theorizing here, though I have to admit, I think a NASA administrator theorized in the same manner that 10 minutes before a Chinese taikonaut lands on the moon, China abrogates the 1960s Outer Space Treaty, which legally you can do, say, nah, I'm not going to do that anymore, and then declare ownership of the moon. I mean, they're doing the same thing in the South China Sea. Why not? They're flaunting the law. Now, I also say, well, that's like Spain saying we own the whole Western Hemisphere with Columbus and all that. Well, good luck defending all of that territory. So, yeah, treaties are nice. I don't really believe in them. I mean, go ahead, do it. Maybe they'll prevent some things happening, but there's just too many weird things can happen in space. And I know, I've been a part of it. Okay, any more questions?
No, sir. Thank you so much for this. We have come to a conclusion. With this, we are ending our session. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us a wonderful and enriching and very thought-provoking session. You're indeed ahead of time. And due to some time constraints, we are unable to further. However, Mr.
I'm sorry, what? Time constraints?
Yes, sir.
No, it's only 11 o'clock here. I'm fine.
Yeah. So due to some time constraints, we are unable to take the further questions. However, audience can still reach out to sir. He has shared his contact info, and you can reach out to him. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for so much for joining.
Okay, thank you for the time. Hopefully it was useful.
Yeah,
We'll
we're
see
looking
ya.
forward to